Dear colleagues, as we unfortunately had to cancel this year's World Congress in Montreal, we thought it would be a good idea to at least share some highlights from the virtual Congress that took place in February. Before the video starts, I would like to announce that the 2022 World Congress in Taipei, Taiwan will take place from June 9th to the 12th. I look forward to seeing you there in person, and now please enjoy the video. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel below for free so you can watch more videos in the next weeks. Thank you.
Hi, this is Christine Sander, and I'm really excited to be part of this symposium, Stronger Together, using PET and MRI in Neuropsychopharmacology. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak today, and I would like to talk today about dopamine D2 receptors and their simultaneous PET measures and fMRI signals. Now, receptor binding can be imaged with both PET and fMRI. Traditionally, in neuroreceptor PET imaging, we can determine an in vivo drug binding that's specific to a target using specific radio tracers and thus determine receptor occupancy. And at the same time, using functional MRI, we can look at the overall functional response or activation due to a stimulus that's presented. And in the context of pharmacological MRI, which is really a form of functional MRI, the stimulus is a drug. So we can look at the in vivo drug response that's occurring if we track that drug using fMRI methods. And the idea is described in this schematic below, where if we can do both PET and fMRI acquisitions together, we can then look at the effect of a drug on its receptor target, and then how that drug elicits a functional response through neuronal activity that's then coupled via energy consumption metabolism to a vascular response, and it is this hemodynamic response that we can track using functional MRI. And so, as I already said, receptor desensitization and internalization is a homeostatic neuroadaptation mechanism that modulates cell signaling, and it has been shown to occur in response to G-protein coupled receptor activation by agonist binding, and that is both by exogenous as well as endogenous agonist. So in terms of a timeline, desensitization and internalization can be pretty fast and occur on the matter of minutes. But once internalized, these receptors can actually stay internalized for a long time and lead to both short-term as well as long-term tolerance if receptors are continuously stimulated. So there is mainly in vitro evidence for this phenomena, and this mechanism has been shown. But in vivo, we don't have direct measurements of desensitization and internalization, and the dynamics are not known because of that. Nevertheless, we do know that it affects neuroimaging data, both PET and fMRI. And so a way to measure receptor desensitization and internalization would allow us to evaluate drug dynamics and understand receptor dysfunction beyond what we can currently measure towards applications of psychiatric disease and substance abuse in release. So for this particular study, we looked at the effect of repeated amphetamine, and because we wanted to understand the divergence in signals. And so what we did in this study is to look at repeated injections of amphetamine at either 0 hour and then a second injection at 3 hours, as well as a second injection at 24 hours. And the goal was really to establish a timeline of D2 receptor internalization and measure recycling rates of dopamine receptor subtypes. The study was done in non-human primates, and we collected fMRI and C11 raclopride PET simultaneously during the entire time frame. Amphetamine was injected during the scan, and we would track the effects on D2 binding as well as the functional signal. So this is the overall, these are the maps, in this case, C11 raclopride PET binding maps. At 0 hour, we can see that there is a strong dopamine release. This shows changes in binding potential, so it's really equivalent to relative occupancy. And at 3 hours and 24 hours, we have a little bit of a blunted response. We still have dopamine release, but slightly less. Now, we also collected simultaneous functional images. And at 0 hour, so during a first amphetamine injection, we see a pattern that is mainly predominantly negative. But when we repeat the same dose of amphetamine at 3 hours, we see a flip in the sign of the response. And then at 24 hours, we actually see a biphasic signal that is both negative and positive. So a slow return to the original, slight original signal, but yet it's still modulated. So an initial amphetamine injection at 0 hour versus at 3 or 24 hours has different effects over time that we can track. Overall, in this study using a combination of PET and fMRI, we have shown that repeated amphetamine exposure causes continuing decreases in C11 raclopride binding, which likely represents a combination of dopamine release and D2-D3 receptor internalization. But we've also shown that a negative CBV response after an initial amphetamine response changes the sign of the signal, and that really at 0 hours D2-D3 receptors dominate the response, whereas at 3 hours D1 receptors dominate the response. And this D1 receptor signaling can be eliminated by blocking with the antagonist SHARM23390. So taken together, this is really in vivo evidence for first time that suggests that there are different recycling rates and internalization mechanism for the D1 versus the D2 and the D3 receptor. And this is in concordance with some in vitro results that have previously been shown that show different recycling rates between D1 and D2 receptors.
Hello, I'm David Nutt, a psychiatrist and neuropsychopharmacologist at Imperial College London. Today I'm going to talk to you about our research comparing 5-HT2A receptor PET, measuring serotonin release capacity, and the relationship of that with amygdala fMRI responses in depression. I want to give credit to the people that did the work, David Arizzo, who is the psychiatrist who recruited the patients and did the PET scans, and Matt Wall, the psychologist and MRI expert who helped us with the fMRI facial studies I'll share with you later. Now, almost since the time serotonin was discovered, which is over 50 years ago, a link with depression has been postulated. These started with post-mortem studies from 1957 onwards, showing a deficit of serotonin in the brains of people who were depressed. The therapeutic effect of MAOIs and reuptake blocking antidepressants, which elevate levels of serotonin, was taken to predict a deficit of serotonin in depression. And to some extent, this was confirmed by CSF studies, largely from Sweden, which showed low levels of the serotonin metabolite, 5-HIAA, were associated with suicide, particularly violent suicide. Many studies showed endocrine blunting to serotonin receptor challenges. And more recently, PET studies on both the 5-HT1A and the 5-HT2A receptors have also shown abnormalities in depression. On top of that, the SSRIs, by enhancing serotonin, have been shown to block amygdala responsivity to fearful faces, and that's become a powerful theory of how they work. And also some studies have shown that genetic variations, particularly of the serotonin transporter site, can lead to more depression. But despite 50 years of research, there's no proof yet in living humans of a serotonin deficit in those who are depressed. And that's what this study set out to explore. So the releaser that David Arizzo decided to explore as a way of studying the serotonin system was amphetamine. We know from animal studies that amphetamine releases serotonin as well as dopamine and noradrenaline. So this is a study published just a couple of years ago when he took healthy volunteers and he did 2 PET scans, one before and one after a challenge of amphetamine. And he showed that there was a significant reduction in the binding potential following the amphetamine, 3 hours following the oral amphetamine. And this was seen across most cortical regions. And the extent of the reduction was around about 14%, which is very similar to the reduction in BP that you see with something like raclopride when you also give an amphetamine challenge. And below here, you see a representative PET scan of before and after. So the amphetamine releases serotonin, which competes with the CINP binding, so there's less binding. And that reduction in binding is an estimate of serotonin release. And we call that the serotonin release capacity. So based on this data, we can conclude that CYMB36 PET plus amphetamine releasing agent can be used to measure serotonin release capacity in humans, whether they're healthy or whether they're depressed. But in the frontal cortex of depressed people, serotonin release capacity is significantly lower than in healthy controls. And the extent of serotonin release capacity in depressed people inversely correlates with depression scores. The more depressed you are, the lower your serotonin release capacity. And this could be the first evidence, really, of an intrinsic deficit of serotonin in the brains of living people with depression. But unfortunately, our fMRI studies of amygdala responses to fearful faces did not show any correlation with serotonin release capacity. And this suggests that the amygdala responses are not a proxy for serotonin release. But I have to caution that conclusion because currently our patient numbers are a little bit too low to be confident of no relationship. But it isn't looking promising, and it may be that that we have to look for other proxies to the PET measures. So thank you very much, and I will now take questions.